Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for tuning in this afternoon for this special webinar discussion, which is part of our series exploring business in the age of coronavirus. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm a business journalist here at Smith School of Business. Of course, like the rest of you, I'm working from home today. Today's topic is coronavirus, what every entrepreneur needs to know right now. Before I introduce today's panelists, I want to remind everyone that today's webinar will be recorded, and you will be receiving a link to that recording in a couple of days. You will also have the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists, and I hope that you will. To do that, you will use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your window. So do not use the chat function, please use the Q&A button, and we'll get those questions to our guest speakers. Finally, I want to let you know that today's webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. It is now my pleasure to briefly introduce our four panelists. I have to make these brief for time, but they have very robust biographies, and I hope that you will investigate those online. George Rossolatos is the CEO of the Canadian Business Growth Fund, where he is responsible for the strategic direction and management of the fund. He has more than 20 years experience as an investor, entrepreneur, and business leader, including as CEO of Avante Logics, Inc., and is the partner and co-founder of TorQuest Partners, Inc., among other companies. Mr. Rossolatos also holds a commerce degree from the Smith School of Business. Jess Joss is the CEO of Equation, a joint venture that brings together 3 angel investment networks, making it the largest in Ontario and the second largest in Canada, though she is currently on sabbatical from that role. She also has more than 20 years of experience in business leadership, entrepreneurship, and investing. Ms. Joss is also a graduate of Queen's University. Elspeth Murray is an associate professor and associate dean of the MBA and master's programs at Smith School of Business, where she is also the director of the Center for Business Venturing and a CIBC Faculty Fellow in Entrepreneurship. Her current research focuses on best practices and managing change to create an analytics culture. Finally, Stephen Smith is the chairman and CEO of First National Financial Corporation. He is also chairman of the Canada Guarantee Mortgage Insurance Company, which he owns in partnership with the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, and the chairman and co-owner of the Duo Bank of Canada, formerly Walmart Canada Bank. He is also a philanthropist. In 2015, he donated $50 million to supporting business education at Queen's University, his alma mater. And I should note, the Smith School of Business is named in his honor. It's really a great pleasure to have all of you with us today. Thank you for taking the time. Is everybody there, and can you all hear me?
Absolutely. Great to be here.
Jess.
That's funny.
There's George. There's Elspeth. Stephen Smith, are you visible? Well, I'll get you to turn on your video as soon as you're able.
Video's on.
Hi, everybody. Nice to have you here with us. So, Stephen, I'm going to start with you. I want to ask you, I mean, all of you are probably very tuned into what's happening right now in the world of business. What are your observations looking at the economy right now? Let's just start there and see where we go. So, Stephen, I'll ask you to begin and we'll take it from there.
Well, that's a bit of a crystal ball. The economy doesn't look very good right now. It's difficult to have so many sectors of the economy shut down and not have a pronounced impact. I think a lot of people are trying to wrestle with that, and we would certainly see a very precipitous drop in economic activity for Q2, perhaps as much as 15 or 20%. I guess the flip side of that is forecasts for the rest of the year would foresee a strong rebound going into Q3 and in Q4. But it's very much up in the air.
Okay, so that's paints a pretty bleak picture to start. Now, all of you are in touch or putting on your entrepreneur hats yourselves, or you're in touch with entrepreneurs. What are you hearing out there from entrepreneurs, from business people?
I think I can weigh in. I mean, things are tough. What I find interesting, though, about building on Stephen's comments is, there's sort of 2 phases at the moment. There's the survive for another day, which everyone's focused on. So that's cash flow, that's, dealing with employees, that's trying to tap into some of the government programs. And I can come back to that as well. But what I also think is interesting is that, you know, even in the worst of times, good things happen, and a lot of great companies get created, human ingenuity kicks in. So I always think that at this moment in time, while you're just surviving, is a golden moment to actually start to reinvest in times getting better. And Stephen, I think that's, you know, part of your story as well.
Well, I think something to remember if you're an entrepreneur here is that it's happening to everybody. This isn't your problem. This is everybody's problem. So right. I think at these times you're sitting here thinking, what am I going to do? Depending what type of business is in, your revenues could have just vaporized overnight. And it's very difficult to deal with that. But it's not you. Something to remember, it's the economy as a whole. And there's just not thousands, tens of thousands, there are millions of people that are in the same boat. So I think something to keep perspective on is that factor. The other thing is, we will get through this. We will get through this, and it's like 2008. It's like any other time. You look back and one manages it through it. I'm reasonably hopeful that I think people will be back to work in 2 months, and it'll be a tough period of time. But 2 months now, 8 weeks, 9 weeks, that seems like a lot of time. But when you look back, it won't seem that bad. And it's going to be tough. It's not you. A lot of people are in the same boat. So I think that's something to keep in mind when you're trying to navigate through things.
Okay, Stephen, I want to come back to you in a minute and ask you about some of your experience weathering these kinds of, well, we've never seen a crisis quite like this one, but some of the things you have weathered. I do want to just go to George and Jess and get their perspectives of what they're hearing out there, and then we'll sort of talk about how to weather it. George, how about you? What are you hearing from entrepreneurs in your realm?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've spoken to, I would imagine, 40 or 50 different entrepreneurs in the past couple of weeks, and similar themes to what have been mentioned. I won't repeat them, but it's interesting that there's a multi-pronged aspect to this. There's the survival of your business. There's the morale and the uncertainty in your people. Many of the entrepreneurs we back and we speak to have young teams that have uncertainty. They're worried about their jobs. They're worried about their health. They're worried about their family's health, their parents' health. They're trying to work from home. Businesses are completely transforming how they run, and all in the context of trying to help your business to survive. And it's an unprecedented barrage that the CEOs are facing. And where they might have had organizational structure before, a lot of these decisions bubble up because there's so much new going on. And so I think CEOs are touching so many parts of their business that they weren't usually touching on a day-to-day basis, and dealing with their own stress at home and working from home and running their business and the pressure that comes along with that. So I think it's a time for entrepreneurs to take a breath. As Stephen says, they're going to get through this, and most are blocking and tackling to figure out ways that they can do that.
Right. And Jess, finally, just want to get you to weigh in on what you've heard.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I've spoken to a number of different entrepreneurs, and there's definitely cash flow challenges. They're looking at how to cut costs, to extend their runway so they don't have to go looking for another round of funding. But I think there's also, a sense that this is a time for innovation. It is a time to look at what you're doing, and is there a different way to deploy it? Are there different markets you could be serving, or are there different client base that you could be serving a different aspect of their needs? So it's an opportunity to be agile and to take a look at how you can sort of work deeply with the relationships that you have to pivot. And I've heard some good news stories as well to touch upon. When I think of companies, there are companies that are doing well because this is what they are thriving in right now. And I love this example, so I thought I'd share it. It's a company founded by Queen's grads. They were people that went through the Queen's Summer Innovation Institute, and they started a company to clean tablets and cell phones in the hospital environment or in clinical environments. And they're called Insulate, and they've been growing. They have a great team. They've been doing a wonderful job. Obviously, a scenario like this is actually a really great opportunity for them. So they have continued to grow at exponential rate over the last couple of months, but they face some challenges. So for example, their production was all overseas in Asia, and around Christmas time, just after Christmas time, that was a real challenge for them. So they tapped into their angel network, the angels that had invested in them, found local manufacturing, and have continued to ramp up, have been hiring at an exponential rate. So that's a nice good news stories. And I think there's a number of other ones out there It's just not necessarily what we see always in the headlines. There may be smaller stories, but they're ones that I think we're really key to keep our eye on, because there's an opportunity for everybody here, and it just takes us a while to find some of those opportunities.
Yeah, okay. It's nice to hear a good news story because a lot of people are struggling right now. But speaking of struggle, Stephen, I want to go back to you and just go back in time a little bit, because you've touched on this. Elspeth, I know you have thoughts on this. Like, we haven't, as I said, seen anything quite like this before, but we've seen tough times, and businesses have had periods where they've really struggled. And I know, Stephen, you've been through some of those periods. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. This period doesn't remind me of '08 as much as it reminds me about '82, '83, when I was in the house building business, and interest rates. And I was young, and it was my first venture, and I was probably a little bit thinly capitalized. But we had a very sharp recession in '82, and interest rates went up to 21%. Hard to imagine now in today's context. But I remember we built our houses, and we couldn't sell them. There was no bid for them. There eventually was a bid, but the bid wiped out the equity and even some of the debt. And I remember going through that period, and it was very, very tough, because it seems like no matter whatever decision you made didn't work. So it tended to be very sapping of confidence. And I remember in the end, we eventually had to sell our properties and take a huge loss, and it resulted in me going personally bankrupt as a result of that. And I sort of remember it as that time, because what I do is I remember the long periods of sort of low-level depression that you get because nothing's happening. You're not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and you're not really too sure what's going to happen, and you're afraid what is going to happen isn't going to be too good. So I can see some analogies in this situation. I think about the only counter I would say to people, and you're seeing that, you're trying to balance, the pressures of your personal life, the depression you're sort of feeling, how are you going to get out of this, what's the outcome. And I'd say about the only thing I would see different in this situation is that I think we can see the end. So the debate is it 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, is it 6 weeks even? I think there's a feeling that it's maybe a little bit longer than shorter, but I get some comfort. Another thing is there are government programs, there are other people in it. When you go and have conversations about deferring your liabilities like rent or taxes or even salaries, you're going to get people that understand the scenario and are willing to probably accommodate more. So that's what I sort of remember. I think the toughest part is just to try to keep a general positive, try to get a positive view, try not to let it get you down psychologically. And that can be tough, because in many ways it's tough because you're at home every day. It's probably, in some ways, going out to work and going to an office gives you a little bit more structure. Interaction with other people gives you more structure. I think this is particularly difficult because when one's at home, one may be talking to people, but it's not the same as having the personal interactions. You don't even have the social interactions maybe at the end of the day that can keep you on even keel. It's very tough psychologically to manage through this.
Elspeth, you have experience, thank you, Stephen. You have experience weathering this kind of thing, I think, in your past. Can you speak to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, when I finished my MBA, it was 1987. And that was, if you look back at all the market crashes, that was a pretty extraordinary moment in time. That was the so-called credit crunch. And my full-time job kind of evaporated overnight. And so then you kind of get creative. And I just wanted to pick up on a couple things. So Jess made a really great point. I mean, the rays of sunshine here go back to human ingenuity. And, when faced with something that seems impossible to solve, people just kind of dig in. And I love the clean slate story. But, early in this, just a couple of weeks ago, although it seems like a year ago, you got all these stories about all these gin distilleries and breweries like totally changing their production line into hand sanitizers. So, I mean, I think there are so many fantastic stories out there. And, you know, I agree again with Jess, like we somehow need to get more of those stories out. Quite frankly, I've stopped reading the news. Stephen, back to your kind of mindset thing. You know, I got into this habit of kind of scrolling through CNN, BBC, CBC, you name it, you know, late in the evening. And I, you know, was not sleeping well. And I thought, like, just stop doing that. Like, why are you doing that to yourself? You know what it's going to say. So why not take that energy and start using it in other ways? But, you know, I have this, from a faculty academic perspective, I have this reel going on in the back of my mind as we're all just responding to the crisis at the moment. And so, you know, people are asking me questions like, well, what can we learn from history? And you see that in the media. People are looking at the Spanish flu. They're looking at 87. They're looking at 2007 and 2008. Everybody's looking for input. And something to kind of go back to. And I guess the one thing I would say is at the root of a lot of those things that happened was basic human fear. So that is the one constant. Like at one point in time, a whole bunch of people became incredibly fearful. They started selling public equities, and then the knock-on effects were pretty extraordinary. So, but there aren't a lot of other things that are common or that we can extrapolate to this moment in time, because it really is truly unique. And there are so many variables now in play that the pattern recognition from past events is not that useful for this current moment in time. So you can take bits and pieces, you know, as Stephen said, governments always respond, you know, liquidity always becomes an issue. So access to cash, all of those things, yes, yes, yes. But just think about all the other variables now. Like we're more connected than we have ever been. Even in 2007, 2008, the connectivity wasn't there. You know, this is very uniquely different from every other sort of previous incarnation. And this is something that I find fascinating. You know, the scientists are the loudest voice at the moment, the doctors and the scientists. So you sort of look back in history and that's never happened. You know, we have all kinds of other tools at our disposal to go local for manufacturing or do stuff online or sell online or rejig like a takeout operation. So I agree completely. The question is not like, will we bounce back? The question is, well, when will we bounce back and how long will it take us to get to, and this is really my final point, you know, what will now be a new normal? You know, I think we have pulled forward many of the things that were always going to happen with this move to virtual everything. And again, you know, it's a time for creative problem solving and to learn a bit from the past, but to look at every opportunity or challenge with a new lens. And I find it also interesting that things that would have taken a long time, like the move to remote health, have happened almost overnight. So all of those stakeholders, the payers, the doctors who were kind of in the, you know, no way, no how category, all of a sudden are doing kind of like house calls remotely. So anyways, I think it's a great time to actually take a lot of notes about all of the things that are happening, because it really is a moment in history.
Well, so you both sound optimistic, which I think is a good thing and probably useful for our audience. But the fact is there are a lot of business owners who are probably worried about being the casualties of the period in, you know, while we wait for the fallout to, you know, land, or whatever the expression is, sorry. George, I mean, in your experience, like, what can entrepreneurs be doing right now to insulate themselves? Let's say they run a business that doesn't translate so immediately to going online. Say they build buildings and nobody's building buildings right now. Like what should they be doing?
Yeah, you know, I'm an optimist by nature, but this is tough times. You know, what we do, I run a private equity fund. We invest in Canadian companies, and that's what we do for a living, is talk to entrepreneurs, and they are hurting really badly. And they range, as the panelists have said. There's some businesses that are doing okay. There's some that are direct hits, you know, that are consumer discretionary, or restaurant or hospitality or travel tourism. And, you know, it's unprecedented where revenue goes from, you know, whatever it is to zero in literally 2 weeks. Some of them have no revenue. You know, there's chains of restaurants and chains of medical, you know, beauty and spa related type businesses that have zero revenue, and they have overhead, they have leases, they have people, they have capital, they have commitments that they've made, they have, you know, they have costs that they need to pay for. And so it is a shock, and a lot of them won't survive. I know the government's working hard to come up with programs, but the order of magnitude of the problem is just bigger than the potential solution, unfortunately. We've seen anecdotal evidence where, you know, where a business that was worth $5 million, we're going to back one company to acquire another. They voluntarily reached out to the acquirer and said, I'll take 2.5, make it over 3 years. I just want my business to survive. Like, that's the kind of, it's changed that quickly. And so what we're advising we've got 9 portfolio companies across Canada, and we're working with them. So I've spoken personally to all the CEOs over the last couple of weeks, and they're, you know, they are doing all the prudent things that you think of doing, like the cutting back of discretionary costs, and, you know, where they're trying to make the pain of layoffs felt across, you know, trying to avoid the layoffs by having 20% pay cuts across the board. And they're consulting with their employees, say, how do we do this? Is everyone in to help us here? The leadership is taking voluntary, you know, deductions. You know, they're where the salespeople can't sell, they're generally taking those salespeople and pointing them towards accounts receivable, because businesses are using accounts receivable sometimes by not by choice, but by need as a working capital tool. They're not paying. They're saying, look, we're not in the office, we're not paying right now. And it's causing a ripple effect. So companies are working really hard to collect those receivables, which are needed more than ever. And so, and obviously hiring is cut back, layoffs have happened. You know, the ones that are, you know, that are not direct hits, that are not zero, have a chance to recover, have a chance to, you know, button down the hatches and try and get through it with some government help. The ones that have no revenue, those are the ones I really feel for the most, because that's an unprecedented situation. And last thing I would say is that it's very hard to help, you know, the startup and growth company world doesn't fit into the boxes that everyone's trying to solve for. You know, for example, you know, a company that's down 30% in revenue can qualify for the 75% wage benefit, but, you know, startups or high growth companies are up 30 or 35 or 40% a year, and, you know, dropping by 30% is over the last year is hard. You know, some of them are up double, and so 30% drop is a hard thing to hit. But meanwhile, they've built up their infrastructure, they've built up their spending, they've built up their capital expenses, and they're ready to keep growing. So they don't qualify. And so I think, you know, there's a category of businesses that's kind of falling through the cracks that we're trying to help. So I'm not sure if that's answered your question, but I think I'm an optimist, but the pain is really severe, and there's going to be a lot of failed businesses, unfortunately, as a result.
Gosh,
I could just begin to just maybe build off of that, George. Like, do you think the governments, you know, are responding as quickly as possible? I mean, I actually thought the emergency program actually showed that they were paying attention just a little bit more. I mean, they never get it quite right policy wise, but I have been heartened by some of the responses. And I think, you know, your point is a really great one. It's like, well, what about this category? And do you think it's possible to float those, get attention, get something done to help everybody?
You know, I think the government's doing, you know, the best that they can. This is such an unprecedented situation. They're getting called from every part of the economy all at once. And, you know, you've got the oil and gas sector. There's so much going on, and you can't solve for everything at once. So I think they're trying to systematically address what they can address. And the other thing is that the magnitude of the problem is bigger than the pool of capital that can solve it. Yeah. We can't just replace our GDP with government money. And so I think I don't envy them. They're in a very tough spot. I think they're doing their best. And, you know, how do you roll out a plan in 4 days? You know, they need 2 or 3 weeks, and that's
you know, I agree with you, George. I think they're doing the best they can, and I think they have to remember is we have this view of this mammoth government. Well, in reality, you got the Deputy Minister of Finance and some people in the PCO office and a couple other departments. It's not like there's probably 5 or 10 or 20 who are trying to think of how to deal with this. And we think there's this monolith and they just sit there and press the button solution. And I just know from the inbound calls I'm getting, they're sort of searching around, well, what should we do? Should we do this? Should we do that? Very, very difficult for them to come up with a solution. the one solution they have. Like, you can argue, well, 75% of wage subsidy, well, that might work. It doesn't work if you're a restaurant, because you don't have any revenues anyway, and you're still not better off. Doesn't, if your business is completely shut down. It's a little bit unclear what that 75% is good, but who is that helping? $40,000 loan. Well, that's a very small business. So I don't know. That's almost a individual type of program. That's almost people who are sort of self-employed, and rather than having a wage, they're doing something on their own. Very difficult to come up with solutions. Even the solution of just giving people money, well, you have to go and spend the money. So you're not going to stores, you're not going to restaurants, you're not doing travel, you're not doing personal services. I think that's all very tough. And they certainly have to put money into the economy, and I think there's doing that. Very difficult for them to come to solutions, because in the end, people aren't working and they're not, and that's how you make money, both for yourself and for the business.
Whoa, tough times. Jess, I was wondering what you've been thinking this whole time. I mean, you're tending on the smaller end of business. What are you thinking over there about, or what are the people you're talking to thinking about the government's response, or anything else we've been talking about?
Well, just in general, when you're looking at angel invested companies, you're looking at quite small. They're post-startup, post-revenue, post-concept, but they're generally small, lean organizations. So trying to find the silver lining in that often means that they have some lower overhead in the earlier days starting up, and they often are pretty tech savvy. So there are some that have adapted well to being more virtual. The ones that are more sort of tech and scalable, there is some opportunities there. As angel investors, I think by and large, people are really reaching out to their portfolio companies and looking at ways to try and help. Angels like to believe that they are the smart money. They're not just the money. So they're trying to look, like anyone who's a good investor, how they can help their companies, so whether it's, connections to new markets, or helping them look at the cash flow projections and, extending their run rates, also helping them look at, how to be a little bit more agile in this time. So I think angels are trying to provide value that way. Angel organizations are trying to offer their portfolio companies education seminars, platforms, and so on. So you see specific angel groups doing that. National Angel Capital Organization had a seminar this morning for angels. They're doing one next week that's geared on incubators and accelerators and reaching directly out to entrepreneurs. So trying to share a lot of information and some best practices and some opportunities. One program that I like right now is through hockeystick.co. It's a company that is a funding platform. It connects founders and funders within North America, and they've expanded to Europe. But they have right now is, for the Canadian context, a matchmaking system between people who are still actively funding and founders that are looking. So they've got 200 verified funders. Now, people are being more judicious with their funding. So, companies that are going to take advantage of this scenario so that they're geared to handle something related to COVID or a spin-off industry, obviously are probably going to be more likely to receive the funding. But there are services out there that are helping people still figure out what there is. But, people's net worth is less than it was a couple of weeks ago. So people are going to be a little bit more judicious. But I think there's always an opportunity for creativity, as Elspeth was saying. This is an opportunity for us. We're resilient by nature as humans, and it's an opportunity to dig deep and have some creativity. And some of the best innovations come out of these challenging times. And if you look at 2008, 2007, 2008, not exactly analogous, but WhatsApp was founded, Slack, Instagram, etc. So there are some good success stories that came out of that, but there's pain sometimes before we get to the success stories.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, for an entrepreneur who's listening to you guys speak, I mean, they're swimming around in this sea of challenging feelings. Probably, Stephen, you talked about depression earlier. I'm sure that's sitting there too. And yet, yes, room for innovation. Do you have concrete advice that you would give an entrepreneur who were to come to you right now and say, what do I do? How do I weather this?
Well, I guess one advice I give to entrepreneurs is that probably your best advice is to take the tough decisions early and as soon as you can. If you have, and you should be looking at your business. You may have to take tough decisions. Often if you're working as an entrepreneur with small groups, you tend to get close, very close to the people that you're working with. And sometimes it's difficult to make those personal decisions. I think you have to think of the health of your business for the long term. Better to have a business that doesn't pay the employees for 2 or 3 months rather than a business that keeps paying, then the business folds. So if you have to make tough decisions with respect to cutting expenses, dealing with perhaps rent, going to your funders, do that sooner than later and try to be proactive. One, you'll give the message to investors, funders, and everyone that you're active, and it just may be very difficult. I think that would be try to get ahead of your problems early. And I think that would be my my advice.
George, you're nodding. You've got some thoughts over there?
I agree. I think that the business needs to survive first and foremost, and it's literally a survival mode, and hard decisions need to be made. Hopefully those can get reversed down the road, but they need to get made, and every line item of your expense line needs to kind of be poured over. And banks are trying to be helpful, landlords are trying to be helpful, other suppliers. You need to knock on every door you can, and on the revenue collection side, they need to really work hard in collecting what they can and try to float. And then in order of priority, going through all the government programs, going through any provincial help that might be available, going through the wage subsidies, trying to almost put a SWAT team on, what do you qualify for, what can you get quickly, and then thinking about your kind of mid-range capital plans if you can do it. And the hard thing is that funds like ours aren't made for emergency funding. We manage other people's money. We have a diligence process. We need to take our 45 to 60 days to do our homework. It's even harder in this time because we're doing diligence sight unseen over video, with accounting firms doing work over video. It makes it harder, not easier. So we're more of a middle term solution to helping companies grow out of this, I think. But there are some shorter term funding opportunities through BDC and through emergency loans and what have you. So a combination of all of that is really important. And the last point is that these companies need to think about, they need to save a bit of money to grow out of this. Once this turns, they need to be able to invest in working capital to grow and purchase inventory and restart their business and rehire. So that's the next phase that they always have to keep an eye on, because it will come. And when it turns, the companies that are ready and have some capital to invest into that growth turnaround will benefit the most.
Interesting. Elspeth, you're nodding too.
Yeah, it's we've got kind of the entire food chain of company size covered here. So I think it's really interesting. We all have a slightly different perspective. I just wanted to share with the group, and this is hot off the press. There's a group that sort of keeps track of the St. Lawrence corridor. So I'm always interested in the big city versus what's happening in the rest of the communities. So they surveyed 128 small, medium-sized businesses. So everything from 1 or 2 person shops up to 100 plus in manufacturing, a whole bunch of different sectors. So the really great thing that really surprised me is only 5% of those companies surveyed said they plan to close the business. So they're taking like the necessary steps. They've downsized, they've furloughed, they're finding different sources of cash. So I found, back to kind of the human ingenuity, and people are really committed to the extent that they can be. But George and Stephen, kind of back to the government programs, what really blew my mind was, these people are busy with a myriad of things. Just as we've been discussing, it's like it's a full frontal assault with like every facet of the business that you need to focus on. And it is block and tackle. Like I know people are out there shipping boxes, driving stuff around, stuff that they would never have imagined. It's sort of all hands on deck. But they said, thank you very much for all the government programs. Those are fantastic. There's a lot of red tape. I don't have time to fill out the forms. So, sometimes it's these really simple things. George, not so much for your companies, but, Jess, for yours. It's like time is the scarce resource here. So, what I was suggesting to a couple of entrepreneurs is like, go and find a university, college student, grade 12 student, sit them in front of the computer and have them just start to fill this stuff out. Because it's out there, but you know, this was the frustration with, I see it, but I can't quite touch it, and I need it now. So that's really what I would add in here, is that it's just interesting how, you know, what you actually see happening versus what, you know, what we might think is happening.
Interesting.
One other element to take into consideration for founders, if you've got a small team, you are the founder, the CEO. Now, as Elspeth said, you might be shipping boxes, but you are the HR department, and you're also trying to keep your team rallied. So as a founder, it's a really challenging time because you're setting the tone within your organization. You're making the challenging decisions, but you're also rallying your team to get them to give the most, perhaps during pay cuts, perhaps during very challenging times, and at a time where people as humans are maybe feeling a bit more needy. So the founders, I think, are in challenging positions because they actually need to show more leadership and more optimism during this time to bring their team along and get people to really engage and double down and look at the sort of, you know, whether it's the 3 months out or the 4 months out. But I think that's really a really important aspect to getting your team through this and getting everyone to give their all during this challenging time, because we're all facing stresses within home life, et cetera, and so on. But if we can rally people and provide that support on top of doing the 17,000 other things that founders are doing, I think that's something that can help their teams.
I would add, you know, the added dynamic that's happening in the venture capital and private equity world is, you know, those that are running those types of businesses are having the same challenges. You know, how do you change your business to deal with this new time? How do you value a company that has no revenue anymore? How do you value a company that's has 200 locations that are all closed? How do you structure an investment into a company like that? How do you do due diligence remotely over video? You know, so every business is struggling to change for the time, and the private equity and venture capital world is the same thing. And what happens a lot of times in these shocks is firms put their pens down. They say, you know, we're going to wait this out because we can't judge this risk. And you know what we're trying to do is figure out how we lean into this, but what are the structures and the protections, and how do you value companies in a way that's fair to the entrepreneur, but fair to your investors you're bringing into this deal? It's a whole new challenge.
It's really hard to imagine that any transactions are going to get it done. How do you do due diligence? You maybe can do due diligence. A lot of it is done over the phone, but in the end, you actually want to go and meet the people in person. And I'd find it very difficult in this environment to go and assess a management team without actually meeting them personally. Maybe you can do some of the due diligence over the phone if you're speaking to your service providers, and one does that a lot now. But I just don't see a lot of transactions being done now. Plus, many private equity firms or investors have enough their hands full just dealing with their own issues and focusing on that, and to some extent making sure they have the capital in case they have to deal with some problems they might have in their own portfolio.
Thanks, everyone. We are getting some questions from the audience. So the first one is for you, Jess. I'm going to start with you, and then anyone else can weigh in. But the question is, what steps should founders take in a startup, particularly with their advisors, board, if they have one, and investors and other stakeholders?
So I think that's a great question. One of the things is open lines of communication and transparency. Really start looking at where you're doing your cost cuttings, how you're going to extend your runway, and being transparent about that, but also tapping into your advisors and your board now as resources so that they can take a look at where they may be able to bring value to the restructuring that you're doing and so on. I think also showing that you are planning, making some of the hard decisions, as Stephen said, taking them early, but including your advisors and your board along the way to show that you're being proactive and to show that you're already planning and thinking for the long term. If you have existing angel investors, you know, they're a great resource. So whether you've got board members, angels that have invested in you, or, you know, you've worked through a regional innovation center or things like that, keep in touch with all those advisors. They are, they are very well connected. There may be opportunities that they see that you haven't necessarily delved into yet, but they can also, you know, by and large, angel investors are exited entrepreneurs that tend to be successful. They may have an experience from a previous challenging time that they can bring forward to help with your business.
Thanks. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one, or shall I boot the next one out?
I can weigh in on that just for a second. I think the other thing is, I agree 1,000% with what Jess said. I think the other thing is, you don't need to have all the answers. You can't have all the answers. You need to engage people in what you know for sure and what you've decided and why. But then that creative problem solving and bringing more minds to bear. But I think there's a belief that you have to have it all figured out. You don't. You just need to have a plan, pay attention, revise on the fly, tell everybody who needs to know what you're doing. But you don't have to have it all figured out.
I think that's great advice. Thank you. How about this question then? Is it better to lay off staff or to work with them to offer reduced hours and wages and keep them on board? How do you know what the right path is?
I don't know that there's, I just don't know that you can give an answer to that without knowing the circumstances of the business.
Okay.
You just can't say, this is right, this is right. Very much depends on the facts.
All right.
I think that the smaller the team, the more likely you can get everyone in a room and work it out together. The bigger the company is, I think you just don't have it's not the ability to do that. And so I think, at best you have a hybrid solution, but I agree, it's company by company.
Okay, anyone else? Yeah. Stephen Smith, this one is specifically for you. I think in reference to the very optimistic thing you said earlier about recovery. So what type of recovery do you see in Q3 and Q4 in Canada? And then the person says V-shaped, U, L shape?
L shape. I think it's going to be a V-shaped recovery.
All right.
So I think we'll plunge in Q2, and I think we'll jump again. So I could see something like a 20% drop, 15-20% in Q2, and then a 30% pickup in Q3, and Q4 compared to Q3 might be flat, maybe up a little bit. There is going to be some damage, and will we be at the same level? We'll probably be. Economy might shrink overall for the year.
Okay, is that your final answer? Anyone else?
Yeah.
I have a moving target answer for that. I think.
All right.
If this is a 4 to 8 week situation, I think we likely will have a V. I think the longer it goes, the more unlikely a V would be, because I think there are a lot of businesses can survive for a month or two, taking all these measures and with some government help. But this goes to 3 and 4 months. Many businesses can't do that, and I think our resources at some point get exasperated. We can't do it, and so the longer this lasts, the more chance this will be a slower recovery. Time will tell. I think we're, in terms of our health response in Ontario, I think we're doing a relatively good job. We're getting better every day. I do worry that the U.S. seems to be quite a bit behind where we are, and having the U.S. as our largest trading partner, does their lowest common denominator become our return to work just by definition? That would be a scary scenario for a lot of businesses.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
Well, I just have another question for the group, and it goes back to, I know you have other questions, but it goes back to business does not actually have much of a voice at the table at the moment. So do you guys believe
voice at what table?
Well, back in the how countries and governments are responding to the virus. Do you think that's wrong? Do you think it's it's time to actually inject that back into the discussion, notwithstanding the fact that we need to do what we need to do health-wise?
Yeah, that's a really interesting discussion, because we've had some context with that by what Donald Trump has been saying with the concept of positing the cure is worse than the disease. And there's certainly no doubt, as you said earlier, Elspeth, the conversation is being dominated by healthcare professionals, at which case, in many ways, that's what they're concerned about at all costs. I think in the end we have the politicians in our system of government who would get other voices in there, and I think they would understand those issues. So I think those voices are being heard, and certainly within the context of how we're dealing with the new cases, I think to the extent that how that plays out will start to influence the conversation. So I understand what you're saying, but I think it's being appropriately dealt with at this time, and I think those voices are being heard.
All right, thank you. Here's another question. So how will the shift to a negative interest rate affect the entrepreneurial ecosystem? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think that's going to make an awful lot of difference,
Okay.
one way or the other.
Okay. The question further has this question: any worries about stagflation, which I must confess is a new term for me?
No, not worried about stagflation.
I agree.
Okay, good. How about Jess or George possibly? Can this pandemic create a new investment behavior in the private equity sector? And if yes, what would that be?
I think it's early to tell, but I mean, there's some businesses that are, per Jess's earlier comments, there are businesses that are thriving. You know, we've invested in a company called Prodigy Game, which is math education for kids that parents pay for, and it's going ballistic right now. I mean, everyone's trying to get their kids busy, and so there are, and that's a low, you know, a highly, you know, business. It doesn't need a lot of people to run. It's highly scalable. You know, those types of businesses really come to the forefront today as being able to stand the test of time. And so, you know, where we all of us in private equity sometimes complain about the recurring revenue businesses are valued at and SaaS businesses are valued at. Well, it's right now that they're showing their worth, because these subscription-based annual type businesses that are B2B, you know, aren't the ones that get turned off with 2 months of hardship. They're the ones that are needed the most in these times. And so I think that the flight to quality of business model, I think, will get more pronounced after this, because you realize, you know, as a private equity person, you know that a certain type of business is worth more than a pure consumer discretionary retail business, but you've never had the context like this to really have the case study as to why. So I do think when entrepreneurs start their businesses, I think they need to think about that and where, and they do to some extent, but this gives them an opportunity to think about you know, businesses that are more immune to shocks like this. But there are businesses that are doing well in the essential services space and the food space, and I think that, you know, I'm not sure if it'll be so much a change, but just more of a flight to quality for venture capital and private equity funds.
Jess, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think, I mean, when you look at angel groups, by and large, they have been operating predominantly in-person monthly events and forums to see the deal flow that way, the curated deal flow. So I think we're starting to look at the ways to use technology, which exists and it's simple, but it, as Stephen says, it doesn't give you the same sort of face-to-face context and so on. So I think one of the things that may percolate out of this as we continue to use technology more and more to find the companies and to what I call start the dating cycle of doing the early due diligence and so on, is I think that companies that have contacts that are known to their angels, known to their investors, that bring forward as mentors, their weighted opinion, I think will probably in the short term become more relevant, because we won't necessarily be able to do the due diligence in the way we've done it before. So having a strong set of advisors early on that can then refer you to your next level of investors may be a very useful thing for companies over the short term, to provide some context when we aren't building the relationships. Because normally as an investor, you think of it as sort of dating, working towards marriage, and there's a lot of face-to-face time before you put your money in. I think we need to look at other ways to bridge those relationships as we're going forward, at least in the short term. And then we can reflect on what we've done well, what we can continue to do and expand as we sort of come into the new investment horizons after we're out of this and following the V of recovery that Stephen's predicting.
All right.
And maybe I could add one thing, just another sort of observation that we've seen, not directly tied to sort of entrepreneurs, but companies are still hiring students. Students are still graduating. They just can't do it in the way in which they've always done it. So in very short order, again, back to, you know, we're really 2.5 weeks into this, they are doing virtual onboarding. There are virtual internships, and they are making hiring decisions without having that face-to-face. So what I wonder is, because of the expediency that's required at this point in time, whether or not we're just naturally going to see more of that, because people simply have to figure it out. And Jess, I couldn't agree more. I think relationships matter a lot. So if entrepreneurs have spare time or, you know, and the need to carve out.
That's an oxymoron, isn't it?
What was that?
Oh, sorry, I said entrepreneurs having spare times. Isn't that an oxymoron?
Yeah,
but
well,
I get
depending on what they're doing now. But it's kind of like, you know, spend time on creating and maintaining those relationships. Do not hunker down. Do not turtle. reach out, make those calls, talk to people, set up Zoom meetings, hold coffee chats. Even people who you have loose ties to, like, go hard at it and establish a different level of rapport. Because I think what you guys are all saying is that's a new aspect of doing due diligence when you can't actually have that face-to-face. So
absolutely.
All right, thank you. We're nearing the end of our webinar. I'll ask you one more and then we'll see where we get to. Do you have any advice on what steps businesses need to take to mitigate cash flow losses or to increase opportunities for cash inflow? Advice for the audience.
Right. I think it would be the same advice I gave earlier in the webinar, which is if you have rent, go to your landlord. Go to your landlord and say, it's tough. I don't have any revenue. I don't think I'll be able to pay you, or what can we do to negotiate, or is there something we can work out? Be doing that. Look at, I think George said, line by line. Go through every line, see what all the expenses are, see what you can cut out. Is there anything discretionary? Just cut it out. And you can't be too ruthless. It's like I think the best analogy is like when you clear out a house, just throw everything out. So it's the same thing. And you think you need it? No, you don't. Just get rid of it.
All right. Any other advice? Yeah, Jess.
I think one of the things is keep in close contact with your clients, because your client base, their needs are changing right now. And there may actually be an opportunity for you to provide services for them because you're already an established relationship. And we're talking about how important relationships are. So there might be something else that you could be providing for them that hasn't been part of your traditional offering, but you're a known quantity, a trusted provider, and it's something within your scope, but it hadn't been part of the bundle you were selling before. So keeping in close contact with your clients and seeing what their emerging and changing needs are is a way where you can, agilely perhaps extend some areas of sales to make up for some of the other areas that you're not able to do at the moment.
And I agree. I'm not going to repeat any of that. I agree with all of it. I think the byproduct of doing all of that is a morale and culture challenge with the people that are remaining. And I think that CEOs need to really not lose focus that's an issue and that's a risk. And especially with younger employees, that they need to be included. They need to, they're anxious, they've got challenges, they're worried, and bringing your team together on video and doing the things that you can't do in person. We had a 5 o'clock cocktail hour on Teams, Microsoft Teams on Friday. It was fantastic. Everyone brought their favorite drink, and like things like that have to be part of the equation to keep the morale of your team and culture in check.
Yeah, I think, George, that's a really good point, particularly when you're in a small group. And generally, when you're a small group, Jess referred to it earlier, when you're a small group, you're managing, you're in HR, you're the HR person, and a lot of small businesses really depend upon the entrepreneur's leadership. And if you're not there in the office, that can disappear because you're only speaking to them for 5 or 10 minutes. You're not getting that 10, 20 minutes every day that you might just get talking about what's going on. So I think you have to be more proactive to reach out and make sure you maintain your relationships with your key group.
And maybe I could just weigh in for the last point on this. And this is just fresh top of my mind. One of our graduates who's an entrepreneur sent a note to her advisory group, and she said, I've just put the business in a state of stasis now, and I just got myself a day job. So I'm going to do a day job. I'm going to keep this baby alive. And when times get a little bit better, I'm going to go back at it. So I think that's another thing. There's an assumption that no one's hiring and there are no, quotes, regular jobs anymore. That's not the case. So there are lots of businesses, as I think many of you have pointed out, that are thriving during this time, and they're looking for really good people. So I think that's the last piece to kind of consider in the toolbox is maybe going that route.
That's great. That's helpful. But here's a question that maybe that's as good timing for this one. So how soon? So the economy is improving in Q3, Stephen. We're on that upward slope. How soon after things start to improve do people jump into their new startups? Like, what's the timing on this?
Well, I think when you can see people are back at work and you start to see that that path. So I know July 1st they can start their business. That's hold me to it. We'll have another webinar on July 1st, see if I was right. So we can have it on June 1st to see if I was right about people being back at work.
Oh yeah, we should do that.
Yeah.
I'm more pessimistic than that.
Yeah, I know. Well, George, we can do an over-under then.
We will. But you know, the other thing we think through is what has fundamentally changed that won't come back. You know, and
Yeah.
as we run our business completely remotely, relatively well, you know, sending two people overnight to go to go to Victoria to meet a company that may or may not be for us. You know, are we going to do that? Should we have the first meetings by Teams or Zoom? Should we? Can we have people working from home? Do we need all that real estate? Like companies are going to start to ask themselves questions based on this experience, and I think it will propel new ideas and new startups and a new ecosystem after.
Well, at First National we have 750 employees in our Toronto office in downtown Toronto real estate, and they're all working from home now. And the interesting comment was from the CFO, who said, "I don't know why I need all these people downtown anymore." I mean, I think he's already thinking he's going to cut people working in the office by half. And I think there'll be a demand from the employees because they can save 45 minutes to an hour each way commuting. And if you do it that maybe you come in every other week, you can still maintain your relationships. I think you're going to see a lot more than that. There were some areas where we were thinking of experimenting with it. Well, we got the experiment, so we'll see how that works. So I think you're going to see a lot more people realizing you can work from home and it can be pretty efficient.
I think we're all rushing back to the normal, and I think there's going to be an opportunity for us to take a pause and take a look at what the new normal is and be intentional about what we want the new, rushing back to normal to be. So if that is not being in the office every day, if that is doing your initial screening virtually, et cetera, and so on, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I will say though that I think when you go to the entrepreneurial psychology, by and large, entrepreneurs are optimists because you generally, to take that leap of faith, whether it's a good time or a bad time, you have to kind of have that slightly kooky gene that allows you to be optimistic, be the vision that only you can see and nobody else can see. So I think as a group, by and large, they're well positioned to look at the opportunities and see the opportunity in futures. It may be only in their mind and they may be the only one that can see it, but then they can move forward and bring people along on that journey.
Entrepreneurs have to be glass half full type of people.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, so speaking of glass half full, we've got a couple minutes left. I would love it if you would all leave our audience with, one or two pithy, hopeful things that they could take away from this conversation. Who wants to go first?
This too shall pass.
All right. Who's next?
I think it's work hard to hang in there because there's an end in sight at some point in the near to mid future. Months, hopefully weeks, and there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and things will come back quicker than they would otherwise come back in other types of downturns.
Jess,
I think this is a time for humanity and compassion, because the reality of it is we're all going through this, we're all in this together, and we're all facing our own personal challenges outside of the business world, and the economy is facing challenges. And if we can act in a way where we're compassionate to our employees, to our suppliers, to our customers, and listen to each other, then I think there's an opportunity for us to get through this and grow together.
Nice. Elspeth.
So I have two because I just couldn't choose. So one is, survive today, conquer tomorrow. And I think that's what a lot of people are doing. There is still opportunity to conquer. And my second one is, without hope, there is only time. And there's a lot of reason for hope. So don't get sucked in the vortex of despair, whether it's 2 months or 8 weeks or whatever, we'll bounce back and use the time to tool up.
That's great. Thank you. I want to thank all of you for your amazing insights and just for taking the time to be with us today. I have to take a moment now to promote the fact that we do lots of remote learning. We have lots of opportunities here at Smith for remote learning. So our audience who've been tuning in weekly already have heard this before, but for those of you who are new, let me remind you that this is a great time to engage in professional development, and Queen's Executive Education offers a number of opportunities to pursue that kind of remote learning. We do live interactive streaming, and you'll find more information at smithqueens.com/execed. You'll see the URL on your screen right now. So I do hope that everyone has enjoyed today's webinar. I want to invite you to join us next week. I will be in conversation with Professor Julian Barling, and the topic will be leading in turbulent times. So that should be a really interesting conversation. The sign-up details for that webinar will be posted on Smith Business Insight very soon, and you'll also get an email inviting you to attend. So with that, George, Jess, Elspeth, Stephen, thank you very much for your fantastic insights and for sharing what you've experienced and for what you know. I think it's probably been very beneficial for our audience. And so thanks again. Hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Have a great day.
Thank you, and good luck, everyone.
Right.
Stay well, be distant.
Yeah, stay safe.
Care.